There is a sound that echoes through eternity, a deep rhythmic hum that is neither wholly mechanical nor entirely human. It is the heartbeat of the Imperium, pounding beneath the endless weight of war. Within this vast, unyielding empire, humanity has learned to sacrifice everything: freedom, compassion, even the memory of what it once meant to be mortal. But among the countless soldiers, priests, and workers who feed this ancient machine, there stands a breed of beings so feared and revered that their very existence seems to eclipse humanity itself. They are the angels of death, the Emperor's chosen, the Space Marines. And yet, beneath the armor and the glory, beneath the hymns and the victory processions, lies a truth that few dare to speak, a truth forged in pain, in indoctrination, in the erasure of the self. For to become a Space Marine is not merely to transcend humanity, it is to lose it entirely. This is not the tale of triumph or divine perfection that the Ministorum preaches. It is the story of what remains when a man is stripped of every weakness, every fear, and every dream, until all that's left is duty incarnate. The first sound he remembered was the rasp of a respirator, drawing in air too thick with chemicals to be called breath. The world was grey, its walls sweating condensation that smelled of iron and antiseptic. Beneath the low red glow of lumen strips, rows of boys huddled together, their heads shaved, their eyes hollow. They were not soldiers yet, barely even human. Each of them had been taken from the dregs of a hive city, from the ash-choked alleys where the sun had long since stopped shining. The recruiters had promised salvation. In truth, they had been delivered into a different kind of death. The chamber pulsed with machinery, cold, relentless, alive. The air carried a hum that seeped into the bones, a constant rhythm like the pulse of a heart that wasn't theirs. Somewhere beyond the metal walls, drills screamed and servitors chanted the binary hymns of preparation. To the mechanicus overseers, this was sacred work. To the boys lying naked on steel slabs, it was only terror. Cassian was one of them. His body was thin but wiry, his skin marked by the grime of the underhive. He didn't remember his family's faces anymore. Hunger had erased them long before the apothecarian had. Now, as mechadendrites lowered around him like the limbs of a patient spider, he felt the sharp edge of clarity, the final realization that there was no going back. "Do not struggle," a voice rasped through a vox grill. "The Emperor provides." The Emperor. The name was supposed to bring peace, but Cassian felt only dread. The machine above him whirred, and a needle the length of his forearm slid into his chest. Fire erupted beneath his ribs. He tried to scream, but his throat was clamped by a metal collar. His vision swam. The world flickered between light and shadow, between pain and oblivion. The first implantation had begun. They told him later that this was the secondary heart, the organ that would one day allow him to fight without rest, to live when others would bleed out. But in that moment, it was only a curse. He felt it beating beneath his flesh, an alien rhythm, out of sync with the one he was born with. Two hearts, two pulses, fighting for dominance. One would win, one would die. Days passed, though in that place, time was meaningless. Each boy was broken and rebuilt, piece by piece, until the line between flesh and machine blurred. Lungs that could filter toxins, osmodular implants to strengthen bone, the biscopia to fuel growth. Each procedure brought agony so profound that Cassian forgot what it meant to rest. He would drift in and out of unconsciousness, half dreaming of light and shadow, half listening to the endless chanting of the tech priests. Sometimes he wondered if the Emperor could hear them. When he finally woke for good, he was not the same. His body had changed, larger now, his muscles heavy and alien beneath the skin. His reflection in the polished metal floor was unrecognizable. The boy who had scavenged food from gutters was gone. What stared back was something incomplete, something still being carved into purpose. "Stand," ordered the apothecary. His armor gleamed with the crimson of Mars, the silver skull of the adeptus mechanicus etched upon his pauldron. Cassian obeyed, though his legs trembled under the weight of new flesh. "Pain is a gift," the apothecary said. His voice filtered through a metallic rasp. "It is proof that you are still imperfect. When you no longer feel it, you will have become what the Emperor intended." Cassian didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat was raw from weeks of screaming. He simply stared at the line of other initiates, dozens of them, each as silent and broken as he was. Some were already dying. Their bodies rejected the organs, twisted into shapes too pitiful for mercy. The servitors dragged them away, chanting the mechanicus litany of reclamation. No waste, no heresy, no deviation. Cassian watched one boy's body convulse as it was carried out. The boy's eyes met, his for a moment, wide, terrified, pleading. Then the light went out of them, and the servitors tore him apart for parts that could still be salvaged. The rest didn't react. They were learning the first lesson of a space marine. Compassion was inefficiency, mercy was weakness, and yet, deep within him, something still stirred, a flicker of the boy he had been, clutching to a memory he could no longer fully recall. A woman's voice, maybe, a laugh, a face that smelled of smoke and warmth. He tried to hold on to it, but it slipped away with every pulse of his alien heart. By the end of the first month, Cassian had stopped counting the procedures. He had stopped wondering when it would end. The transformation was no longer a sequence of surgeries, it was a ritual of forgetting. With every new graft, every new implant, something else within him went silent. One night, he woke to find the chamber dark. For the first time, there were no chants, no drills, no mechanized prayers, just the faint whisper of his own breathing, and the rhythmic beat of two hearts, one fading, one ascending. He pressed a hand to his chest, and felt the stronger one take control. The weaker heart slowed, stuttered, then ceased, and in that silence, Cassian understood. To become an angel of death, one must first die twice, once as a man, and again as a memory. He closed his eyes and whispered the first words he had spoken in weeks. For the Emperor. The words tasted like rust. Cassian awoke to the smell of oil and blood. The chamber around him thrummed with mechanical hymns, low, pulsing chants sung by servitors whose tongues were made of steel and whose lungs hissed with steam. He was lying on his back again, strapped to another operating slab, though this time he didn't resist. He had long since learned the futility of struggle. Resistance had been a human instinct, and human instincts were meant to be excised. Above him, a figure loomed, a silhouette wrapped in crimson robes, mechadendrites twitching like the feelers of some predatory insect. Its voice was both mechanical and ancient, filtered through layers of vox distortion. Subject 973. Secondary organs stable, neural coherence acceptable. Initiate stage 5. Cassian's eyes flickered toward the metal ceiling as a drill descended with slow, deliberate precision. It wasn't the pain he feared anymore, it was the emptiness that followed. Each new organ, each implant didn't just change him, it took something away. A memory here, a feeling there. The warmth of fear was being replaced with the cold certainty of obedience. He thought for a brief moment that he heard someone screaming, but it was no one in the room. It was a voice buried inside his mind, faint and desperate. Don't forget. The drill made contact. A blinding pulse of light consumed his thoughts, and for a moment Cassian was nowhere. The world dissolved into pure sensation, a river of heat and pressure flowing through every nerve. When he came back to himself, he was different again, stronger perhaps, more complete, but less alive. He tried to remember the voice. It was gone. The next phase began without warning. They injected him with something dark and heavy, a fluid that felt alive as it coursed through his veins. The apothecary called it the black carapace, the sacred interface that would one day bond him to his power armor. Its purpose was divine, they said. Its effect was transcendence. But to Cassian, it was invasion. The sensation was unbearable. It wasn't just under his skin, it was inside it, rewriting it. He felt the liquid crawl through his flesh, threading itself into his nerves, his spine, his skull. Every sense exploded. He could feel the hum of the lumen strips above him, the vibration of the servitor's metal feet against the floor, the faint electric charge of the air itself. He wasn't merely seeing the world anymore, he was connected to it. When the spasm stopped, he lay there trembling, his body soaked in sweat. The apothecary leaned over him, studying the readouts. Integration complete. You are now compatible with the armor of the adeptus astartes. You should be honored. Initiate. Honored. The word meant nothing to him now. They gave him time to recover, or at least something that resembled it. He was moved to a barracks lined with iron bunks, each one occupied by another initiate. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and blood. No one spoke. They sat in silence, their eyes distant, their bodies twitching occasionally as their new organs settled into place. Cassian stared at the wall opposite him. It was marked with the sigil of the chapter he would one day serve, a stylized winged skull, carved deep into the metal. He didn't know its name yet. The instructors said they weren't ready to be told. Names were for the faithful, the faithless were just numbers. He lay awake for hours, listening to the mechanical breathing of the others. Some nights he could hear them crying softly in their sleep, though by dawn, those same voices would speak in perfect monotone during drills, as if the sorrow had been overwritten by mourning. Perhaps it had. On the 7th day, they were brought into the training halls for the first time. The place was colossal, vaulted ceilings vanishing into shadow, lined with colossal statues of armored giants. The air reeked of ozone and promethium. Rows of initiates stood at attention, while a figure in black and gold armor paced before them. His presence was suffocating, his voice a weapon of command. "I am Captain Varian, of the 10th Company. You are not soldiers, you are not men, you are raw matter. The flesh from which the Emperor will carve angels." He stopped before Cassian, his eyes cold behind the lenses of his helm. "Do you believe yourself strong?" Cassian hesitated, his voice was hoarse. "I serve the Emperor." The captain struck him with the back of his gauntlet, the impact like being hit by a piston. Cassian fell to the ground, his teeth cracking against the steel floor. "Faith without strength is heresy," Varian said, his tone unchanged. "Strength without faith is corruption. You will learn both, or you will die." Cassian didn't move. The captain continued down the line, striking others at random, testing their resolve. Each blow echoed like thunder in the cavernous hall. None was spared, none dared to protest. The pain was not punishment, it was instruction. That night Cassian sat alone in the corner of the barracks, his lips split, his jaw aching. He stared down at his hands, hands that no longer looked like his own. The skin was thicker, the veins darker, the strength unnatural. He flexed his fingers and watched the muscle shift beneath the surface like something alive and separate from him. He wanted to believe this suffering meant something, that the Emperor was watching, that there was purpose in the agony, but the longer he stared, the less he believed it. The more they built him into a weapon, the more he feared that the human part of him, the part that could still believe, was dying faster than anything else. The next morning, when the klaxon sounded and the drills began anew, Cassian did not think or pray or question, he simply obeyed. The transformation was working, and as the sunless light of the training halls flickered across his face, he realized that for the first time since he'd arrived, he couldn't remember the sound of his own name. Days bled into one another like oil seeping into sand, thick and without distinction. Cassian no longer marked time by hours or shifts but by the procedures carved into his memory, each more invasive, each more precise. The apothecaries spoke of refinement and purification, but their tools were scalpels, drills and blades. The transformation of flesh into sanctified armor was never elegant, it was brutal, clinical and slow. Cassian's mornings began before thought. The klaxons would wail across the dormitories, and the initiates, half men, half unfinished machinery, would rise as one. The air always stank of blood and solvent. They ate nutrient paste that tasted of iron, drank water that was colder than logic, and marched in silence to the training pits. The instructors stripped away language. They forbade conversation except for liturgical recitation. When they were ordered to chant, they did so in unison, their voices a single sound of submission. When they were ordered to fight, they did so without hesitation, without thought. Cassian lost his first fight on the second day. He had hesitated, just for a heartbeat, just long enough to remember the name of the man facing him. His opponent had been Soren, another initiate from his cell whose hands still trembled when he prayed. Cassian saw fear in his eyes and felt it echo in his own chest. He should have struck. Instead he faltered. Soren did not. The strike came swift and clean. A training blade shattered Cassian's ribs and sent him sprawling to the metal floor. The instructor had said nothing. He simply ordered the servitors to drag Cassian away. The medici adepts repaired the damage with bone grafts and synthetic ligaments. When Cassian awoke, Soren was gone. No one spoke of him again. They learned quickly what silence meant. The barracks grew emptier by the week. At night, when the machines quieted and the chanting ceased, Cassian would stare up at the dark ceiling. He had begun to feel something unfamiliar, a pressure at the edge of his mind. It wasn't thought, not exactly. It was a presence, like static just beneath the skin, like whispers threading through the circuits of his nerves. Sometimes he could almost hear words, distant and impossible to decipher. Sometimes he imagined they belonged to the Emperor himself, but deep down, a darker thought whispered, what if they belonged to something else? The apothecaries never spoke of the mind. They concerned themselves with flesh and function, with glands that produced adrenaline at command, with blood that could clot instantly and resist infection. They called it perfection, but Cassian could feel the imbalance growing inside him, the widening gulf between body and soul. The stronger his limbs became, the weaker his will seemed to grow. Then came the trial of endurance. They were herded into a vast subterranean chamber filled with haze and heat. The floor was a labyrinth of molten steel channels, the walls lined with statues of the Emperor in his golden armor. Their task was simple: cross the chamber unaided, while carrying the weights assigned to them, massive iron burdens shaped like imperial sigils. The air shimmered with heat. The floor burned through their boots. Each breath tasted like ash. One by one the initiates stumbled and fell. The medici observed without emotion, marking each failure on their data slates. Cassian's burden was heavier than the others, a twin-headed aquila forged from dense alloy. Its edges tore at his shoulders as he lifted it, the metal scalding his skin. He walked anyway, step by step, his vision darkened, his heartbeat slowed, and his breath came in short, ragged gasps. He thought of Soren. He thought of the nameless initiates who had vanished into silence. He thought of the captain's voice echoing in the hall. Faith without strength is heresy. He did not pray, he simply moved forward. When he reached the other side, his legs gave way. The aquila fell beside him with a clang that echoed like a tolling bell. The apothecaries noted his endurance score. No praise, no words of acknowledgement, only numbers. That night, when he collapsed onto his bunk, his hands still burned. He could smell his own flesh cooked raw. Yet beneath the pain, something within him had shifted. A quiet realization settled in his mind that survival here was not about faith or glory. It was about endurance. Enduring until nothing was left to take away. Weeks passed. They were fitted for neural jacks and interface nodes. The tech priests recited binary prayers as they drilled ports into the base of each skull. Cassian felt the machine touch his mind and flinch. He saw patterns that weren't there, whispers of data that slipped between his thoughts. He wondered, for a fleeting second, if the machine could hear him think. During the next combat simulation, the world came alive. His reflexes were sharper, his body faster. He could predict movements before they happened, sense impact before it arrived. The apothecaries called it progress. The instructors called it purpose. Cassian didn't call it anything. He just obeyed. But late one night, when the lights dimmed and the world fell quiet, he saw Soren again, in his mind, not in flesh. His voice was faint, carried through a dream. "Don't forget," it said, the same words Cassian had heard before the drill, before the black carapace. He woke with a start, his pulse hammering. The words clung to him like oil, heavy and unshakable. Don't forget. But forget what? His name, his past, the sound of his mother's voice, long gone from memory. He rose from his bunk and stood before the sigil on the wall, tracing the twin-headed eagle with a trembling hand. The symbol was supposed to bring strength, faith, purpose, but all he could see in it was the shape of something watching, something vast, unblinking, and silent. For the first time since his arrival, Cassian felt fear again. Real fear, not the kind that made him freeze, but the kind that whispered truth, that whatever he was becoming, it was not a man, it was something else, something holy, perhaps, but holy things were rarely kind. And as the alarm called them once more to the halls of training, he wondered if this was what the Emperor had wanted, or what mankind had forced upon him. The first storm came without warning. Not a storm of rain or wind, but of light, pure, blinding light that turned the dormitories into silhouettes. The walls shook as alarms screamed through the vox grills, their tones shrill and reverent. The initiates rose in silence, already conditioned to obey. The apothecaries entered without haste, their robes fluttering like dark wings as they issued new orders. There was no explanation, no instruction beyond obedience. Each recruit was to follow to the chamber below, where their final test awaited. Cassian walked among them, the black veins beneath his skin pulsing faintly with new grafts. He could feel his heartbeat through the armor plating now embedded in his chest. The corridor descended in slow spirals, air growing heavier with each turn. The scent of ozone and sanctified oil filled his nostrils. At the end, a great vault door waited, carved with the sigil of the chapter. Twin eagles' wings spread wide across an ocean of script. When it opened, the sound was not mechanical but alive, a groaning, sacred exhalation that seemed to breathe across their faces. Inside lay the implantation hall. The air shimmered with incense and heat. Servitors moved in lines like ants, their mechanical limbs carrying trays of organs suspended in nutrient fluid. Each was catalogued, numbered and labeled with purity seals. Cassian's mind blanked as he stepped onto the platform. This was the final act of rebirth, the implantation of the black carapace. The apothecaries had spoken of it as both miracle and death. Some initiates would not survive. Those who did would never again be human. He was strapped to the slab, arms spread, head restrained. He could hear the hum of the machines preparing. The apothecary assigned to him, Magos Helion, recited the litanies of transformation under his breath, a low drone of words that seemed older than language itself. Flesh is weak, Helion whispered. Faith is strong. The body is nothing but a vessel for purpose. Cassian wanted to speak, to ask what purpose could demand this much suffering, but the words never came. The first incision silenced thought itself. His body convulsed as the augers pierced his flesh, weaving the interface beneath his skin. The pain was pure, perfect, endless. He bit through his lip and tasted iron. His vision fractured into light. There were flashes, memories, dreams, hallucinations, a child's face. The sky of terror, hidden beneath its eternal smog, a golden figure rising from a sea of broken men. The Emperor's eyes, not human, not divine, but something deeper like stars collapsing inward. When he awoke, the world was distant, muted. His heartbeat no longer felt like his own. Every movement sang with mechanical harmony. He could sense the data streams around him, faint whispers of energy running through the walls. His body no longer belonged entirely to him. Days later they were fitted into armor for the first time, not the full ceramite of the astartes, but training shells, molded to connect with the carapace beneath their skin. The sensation of it locking into place was unlike anything Cassian had known. It was as if his body had expanded, as if he had grown a second skin made of fire and steel. The armor responded to his thoughts. A mere flicker of will could move its limbs. He was both inside it and part of it, inseparable. For the first time, he understood the silence of the custodians who had watched him at the trial's beginning. They had looked upon him not with pity, but with recognition. They had once walked this same path, perhaps not in flesh, but in devotion, and yet, something gnawed at him still. The transformation was supposed to feel holy, transcendent. Instead, he felt hollow. Every improvement to his body seemed to strip something away from his mind. The memories of his family, his home, even his own laughter, blurred now, fading like echoes lost in static. He spoke of this once, to another initiate named Cal. They sat in the recharging hall, armor disengaged, the air still humming from the day's drills. Cowell had been silent for weeks, his eyes always distant. When Cassian mentioned the hollow feeling, Cowell only nodded. That's the point, he said quietly. We're not meant to carry who we were. We're being emptied so something greater can fill us. Cassian didn't ask what that something was. He wasn't sure he wanted to know. Later that night, he dreamt of the Emperor again, but not as a man, nor even a god. In the dream, the Emperor was a presence that filled everything, like sunlight through fog. Around him drifted legions of astartes, their armor shining gold and white. But as Cassian drew closer, he saw that their faces were gone, replaced with smooth, unbroken plates of metal. They turned toward him, and in one voice they whispered, "Forget." He woke gasping. The words still echoed in his mind. In the morning, he reported to the final assembly. The surviving initiates, barely half of those who had begun, stood in formation before the dais. The master of recruits addressed them through the vox amplifiers. His voice carried no emotion, no pride. "You are not yet space marines," he said. "You are fragments, half built, half broken, but you have endured. That is all that matters." Behind him, banners of the chapter fluttered in the recycled air, each marked with sigils of triumph long past. Cassian stared at them and felt nothing, not awe, not hope, not fear, just the quiet hum of machinery under his skin. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the implants and the armor, a question took shape, a heresy so small he dared not speak it aloud. If we must become less than human to serve humanity, what is left worth saving? The ceremony ended. The lights dimmed. The initiates dispersed into the endless corridors. Cassian lingered for a moment longer, staring at the great statue of the Emperor that loomed over the hall. Its golden eyes caught the dim light, and seemed for just a breath, to flicker with life. He turned away, not in reverence, but in exhaustion. His path was set, his name, his past, his will, sacrificed on the altar of devotion. Whatever came next, it would not belong to him, and so ended his forging, not with triumph, but with silence. The first dawn Cassian saw after his transformation was not of sunlight but of firelight, reflected from the manufactorum spires of the fortress monastery. The air above the training grounds shimmered with heat from Promethean torches, their flames bending and folding in the wind like the banners of long-dead crusades. The recruits stood in rows, their armor polished but incomplete, each piece a promise of the warrior they would one day become. Cassian could feel the vibration of the power lines beneath his boots, running deep through the earth like arteries beneath skin. The monastery lived, breathed, and pulsed like a creature, its forges never silent, its prayers never ending. The planet itself seemed to tremble beneath the will of the Imperium. Their training had changed. No longer were they drilled merely to survive, now they were sculpted to serve. The instructors, once physicians and priests, had become wardens of precision. Each lesson was a refinement of movement and thought, every breath a measure of control. They were taught to march, not as men, but as extensions of one will, an echo of the Emperor's silent command. Cassian's new body responded with terrifying efficiency. His reflexes, once human, now bordered on instinctual calculation. He could hear the subtle hum of his armor, feel the pulse of its power core like a second heartbeat. When he lifted his training bolter for the first time, its weight felt natural, almost comforting. The weapon was not an instrument but an extension of his will, a communion of machine and flesh. Glory, the instructor said one day pacing before them, is not found in the moment of victory. It is found in the willingness to die before that moment arrives. To serve without question, to fall without hesitation, that is the weight of glory. The words struck something deep within Cassian, but not in the way the instructor intended. There was pride, yes, but also something heavier, a sense of inevitability. Glory, it seemed, was not reward but burden. During the night cycles, Cassian began to hear the hymns of the fortress carried on the wind, chants of devotion from the chapel halls where the chaplains performed the rites of battle. Their voices were amplified through vox pylons, rising and falling like the ocean against the stone. Sometimes, when the echoes reached his barracks, Cassian imagined he could hear something beneath the words, a low undertone, like the growl of distant thunder, or perhaps of something far older and deeper. Rumor spread among the initiates of those who had failed their final transformations. Some said their bodies rejected the implants, turning against themselves in spasms of agony. Others whispered of worse fates, that the mind could fracture before the flesh did. Those who broke were taken below the monastery, and never seen again. Cassian didn't believe all of it, but he had learned that belief was not required for fear to exist. One night, during weapons calibration, he stood before the viewing window of the forge sanctum. The firelight bathed the chamber in gold. Beyond the glass, a group of fully armored astartes walked in solemn formation, their armor marked with centuries of battle honors. They were enormous, radiant, terrible. Their every step carried purpose. And yet, Cassian noticed something strange. When one of the space marines turned toward him, their helmet caught the light, and for the briefest instant, he thought he saw emptiness behind the lenses. No face, no eyes, no trace of the man that might have been, only the faint reflection of the forge's flame. He blinked, and the image was gone. "Admiring your future, initiate." The voice came from behind, a deep, resonant tone that filled the chamber like thunder rolling through cathedrals. Cassian turned to see Chaplain Veridus, his skull-faced helm polished to a mirror sheen. The black armor of his office absorbed the light, and his crozius rested across one shoulder like the symbol of divine judgment. "Yes, my lord," Cassian said, bowing his head. "Do not bow," Veridus said softly. "Your submission should be inward. A bowed head is seen by men. The Emperor sees the heart." Cassian straightened, his chest tight beneath the carapace. The chaplain studied him for a long moment, his gaze unreadable behind the skull mask. "Tell me," Veridus said finally, "what do you think you saw when you looked upon them?" Cassian hesitated. "Perfection, my lord." A low sound came from the chaplain's vox grill, something between a laugh and a sigh. "Perfection is for gods, not for men. Even angels of death are still bound by the flaws of the clay from which they were formed. Remember that, initiate." The Emperor did not craft his warriors to be flawless. He made them to endure. Cassian nodded, unsure if he understood. "Endurance," Veridus continued, "is the truest form of faith. For when all else is stripped away, belief, purpose, even hope, only endurance remains. And that, initiate, is the Emperor's will made manifest." He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing through the corridor like the tolling of a funeral bell. Cassian stood in silence long after the chaplain had gone. The forge continued to burn, its fires fed by the endless labor of servitors and priests. The air shimmered with heat and devotion, and somewhere deep within, beneath the layers of augmentation and discipline, Cassian felt a pulse that was not his own, a whisper of something ancient, watching, waiting, patient as the stars. That night, as he lay in his bunk, the whispers returned, louder this time, not voices exactly, but impressions, like words spoken through glass. He could not decipher them, but he knew their tone. It was not command, it was not comfort, it was curiosity. And Cassian, in that moment, realized that something beyond even the Emperor's light was listening. The drills intensified. Each day became a ritual of exhaustion, an offering of blood and sweat to the sanctum's unrelenting creed. The recruits no longer fought for victory. They fought for the right to remain. The instructors did not measure success in kills or precision, but in silence. Hesitation was sin. Doubt was heresy. Those who faltered vanished before the next sunrise, their bunks emptied, their names erased from the data slates, as if they had never existed. Cassian learned quickly that survival depended on surrendering thought. The more he questioned, the slower he became. The slower he became, the more he risked drawing attention, so he trained without question, repeating the motions until his body obeyed before his mind could interfere. The bolter's recoil no longer jarred him, his armor no longer felt foreign. When he ran, his feet struck the ground with the weight of inevitability, and yet something inside him still resisted. It was faint, buried deep beneath layers of indoctrination, but it pulsed like an ember refusing to die. One morning, during a live combat exercise, that ember threatened to flare. The recruits were ordered into a simulated assault on a fortified position, a recreation of a hive city under rebellion. Smoke poured from the manufactorum chimneys, and the air was choked with artificial ash. Vox chatter hissed through their helmets, carrying orders from unseen commanders. Cassian moved with his squad through the ruins, the bolter heavy and alive in his hands. Every target that appeared was a shape of light and motion, simulated but convincing enough that the mind could not easily tell the difference. He aimed, fired, advanced. The rhythm of war was hypnotic. Then through the haze, he saw movement that did not belong to the simulation, a figure stumbling from behind a broken wall, unarmed, coughing. For a moment Cassian thought it part of the exercise, another test. But then he saw the man's eyes, human eyes wide with fear. A worker perhaps, or one of the monastery's indentured laborers. The man lifted his hands, pleading. Cassian's visor display marked him as a non-combatant, irrelevant to the objective. The vox in his ear barked a command: eliminate all hostiles, leave no flesh unpurged. He hesitated, just long enough for doubt to find its voice. Do it, his squad leader growled. Cassian's finger tightened on the trigger, but he aimed wide, letting the shot tear into the wall beside the man. The worker fell to the ground, covering his head. The exercise ended seconds later. The silence that followed was suffocating. Cassian knew, even before the order came, that his hesitation had been seen. He was summoned to the chapel of penitence at dusk. The hall was vast and cold, lit only by the glow of incense braziers. The chaplain waited at the altar, his skull helm gleaming like bone beneath the firelight. Approach, Veritas said. Cassian obeyed, each step echoing across the marble floor. You spared a life, the chaplain said, his tone neither angry nor approving, simply factual. Explain. Cassian hesitated. He was unarmed, my lord. A worker, not an enemy. Veritas was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost tender. Do you think the enemies of mankind announce themselves, initiate? Do you think chaos waits until you are certain before it strikes? I thought mercy, Veritas interrupted, is a weapon of the weak. You were not bred for mercy. You were made for obedience. The words cut deeper than the apothecary's blades ever had. Veritas stepped closer, lowering his voice. Tell me, Cassian, when you looked into that man's eyes, did you see yourself? Cassian didn't answer. The chaplain's silence stretched on, heavy as lead. Then, unexpectedly, he placed a hand upon Cassian's shoulder. The gesture was almost human. Do not mistake your conscience for weakness. The Emperor made men to question, but he made warriors to obey. The day will come when you will no longer ask why. That is the day you will truly belong to him. Cassian bowed his head, unsure if he was comforted or condemned. When he left the chapel, the night was black and absolute. The wind cut across the courtyard, carrying with it the distant hum of forges and the echo of 1,000 whispered prayers. Above him, the stars were barely visible through the planetary haze, but one light shone brighter than the rest, a single point that flickered like a watchful eye. He stared at it for a long time, wondering if the Emperor's gaze could truly reach this far, or if perhaps something else was looking back. The following day, the chaplain addressed the entire company. "The body is steel, the mind is duty, but the soul," he said, pacing before them, "the soul must be purged. Only then can you carry the Emperor's light without faltering." His crozier struck the ground with a sound like thunder. "Those who question will suffer, those who hesitate will fall. Only through sacrifice is purity achieved." Cassian repeated the words with the others, his voice steady, his eyes forward, but inside, he could still feel the echo of the man's terrified gaze, burned into his memory like a brand. That night, he dreamt again. He stood in the same ruin, smoke thick around him, but when he lifted his bolter, the weapon spoke, not in thunder but in whispers. It asked him a question he could not bear to answer, and when he awoke, his armor's systems registered a surge in heart rate, neural interference, and fluctuating signal from his carapace interface. The Medicae found nothing wrong, yet Cassian knew something inside him was changing again, something that had nothing to do with the flesh. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into something harder to name. Time in the monastery did not flow, it marched a relentless mechanical rhythm. The recruits slept little, spoke less, and learned to exist as parts of a single machine. They were stripped of individuality, molded into perfect obedience. Cassian moved through it all like a ghost wearing flesh. He fired, he fought, he knelt when commanded, but his mind was a battlefield of its own. The image of the worker, those frightened human eyes, haunted him more than any nightmare. It became the mirror he could not escape. One evening, while scrubbing the ceramite of his armor, Cassian overheard two of the others whispering near the racks. "They say Veridus once served with the angels penitent," one murmured. "The ones who turned against their own order," the other replied. "No," the first said quickly, glancing around, "the ones who purged them." Cassian pretended not to listen, but the words rooted themselves in his mind. The chaplain, who spoke of obedience with the softness of faith, had once exterminated those who questioned too deeply. It made sense. It explained the man's calm. He had already looked into the abyss and found peace within it. Later that night, Cassian was summoned again. This time, not to the chapel. The summons came from the apothecarian, where initiates went only for augmentation or punishment. He followed the servo skull that led him through sterile corridors into a chamber that reeked of antiseptic and oil. There, under the harsh glare of lumen strips, stood the chief apothecary, his white armor streaked with stains that looked disturbingly organic. "Cassian," the apothecary said without looking up from his instruments, "you've been selected for advancement." The words sounded like a reward, but the tone, cold and detached, made Cassian's stomach twist. He was ordered to strip down and lie upon a slab. Servo arms unfolded from the ceiling like metallic serpents. Each bore a different tool: scalpel, injector, saw. Cassian had been through implantation before, but this was different. There was no sedation, no ritual chant, just the whine of machinery and the cold, clinical precision of what came next. The apothecary worked in silence. Tubes were inserted into Cassian's spine, threading through flesh and nerve. The pain was distant at first, a pressure deep in his skull, then it ignited, flooding his mind with light. He could feel the gene seed, his being tested, measured and reinforced. It was like having his humanity rewritten line by line. Somewhere far away, he heard Veridus's voice through a vox speaker. "Endure this, Cassian, this is the weight of glory. The Emperor burns away the weakness of the old man to forge the new." Cassian's mouth opened in a silent scream. His veins felt filled with molten iron. He saw visions, burning skies, screaming worlds, figures in golden armor striding through blood and ash. He saw the Emperor's light, not as a beacon but as a consuming flame. Then darkness. When he awoke he was different, stronger, yes, but also emptier. His thoughts came slower, as though filtered through a new mechanism that dulled their edges. Even fear seemed blunted. The chaplain called it purification. For days afterward, Cassian trained without rest. His movements were sharper, his reflexes faster. He began to feel the rhythm of battle, not as chaos, but as music, each shot, each strike, a note in the Emperor's endless hymn. His instructors praised him. He was told that he was becoming worthy. And yet in the brief silence between drills, he sometimes caught himself listening to the echo of a human heartbeat beneath all that armor. His own, still there, still stubborn. One night, while on maintenance duty, Cassian entered the armory alone. Rows of relics and weapons stood like silent sentinels. In the far corner, half shrouded in cloth, lay something different, a broken helmet, its surface scarred and blackened. The markings were old, unfamiliar. He brushed away the dust and saw a symbol etched beneath Bive, Legion, World Eaters. The sight struck him like a physical blow. He'd heard of them in whispered cautionary tales, the butchers of the great heresy, warriors who gave themselves so completely to rage that their souls were devoured by it. Monsters who had once been noble. He wondered if they too had once stood where he was now, believing they were being purified. The next morning, Cassian's squad was deployed for a live mission. Not a simulation this time, but a cleansing. Rebels in the lower hives of Carthion Prime. "You will bring the Emperor's peace," Veridus said before they boarded the transport. Through fire and faith, the descent was swift. The hive city below was a labyrinth of ruin, flickering lumen signs, rusted towers, the air thick with dust and decay. The moment their boots touched the ground, the order came: purge all resistance. Cassian moved with his brothers through narrow corridors, bolter roaring, muzzle flash painting the darkness. The rebels were poorly armed, desperate. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. And then, amidst the carnage, Cassian saw him again. The same man, the worker from the simulation, or someone who looked just like him. He stood frozen, a child clinging to his leg. Cassian's visor target lock flickered red. The machine spirit awaited his command. For a long moment, Cassian did nothing. The bolter trembled in his hands. Around him, his brothers were killing without pause, without thought. Then the child screamed. Cassian lowered his weapon. A second later, Veridus's voice thundered over the vox. "Cassian, execute your duty."
But
Cassian didn't move. He stood there staring at the terrified faces before him, two fragile sparks of life in a universe drowning in fire, and for the first time, he understood what the Emperor's light truly cost. In the silence that followed, Cassian knew he had made his choice, and that choice would damn him. When the thunder of bolters finally ceased, the only sound left in the hive was the echo of boots crunching over ash. Cassian stood motionless amidst the ruin, his armor flecked with soot and blood that did not belong to him. The air was heavy with the metallic tang of promethium and the sour stink of burnt flesh. Smoke curled like restless spirits through shattered corridors, and every rising wisp seemed to whisper the same word: why? The child and the worker lay still where they had fallen. Cassian hadn't fired. Someone else had. A brother beside him, one who hadn't hesitated. The world slowed as Cassian's helm displays flickered, struggling to focus on the bodies before him. A warning glyph blinked in his visor, requesting a biometric confirmation. Target neutralized. He didn't respond. He couldn't. He simply stared as the warmth of the battlefield faded into the cold clarity of guilt. Behind him came the rhythmic tread of power-armored boots. The others were regrouping, moving with mechanical precision. Veridus' voice broke the silence. "Gather the fallen, burn what remains. The Emperor's justice leaves no shadow." Cassian's grip tightened on his bolter, the servos in his gauntlet whining softly. He felt his throat constrict, as though some unseen force were crushing it from within. The words he wanted to speak dissolved before they reached his lips. There was nothing left to say. When they returned to the ship, the silence followed them like a curse. None of the recruits spoke. None dared. The chaplain's sermons had told them that purity was clarity, that doubt was the first crack through which corruption seeped. But Cassian now knew the truth. Purity was simply obedience wearing the mask of holiness. He spent the following night in the sanctum, alone. The flickering votive candles cast long shadows across the walls, their light dancing against the engraved image of the Emperor's visage. Cassian removed his helmet and placed it at his feet. The weight of it seemed unbearable now. It wasn't just armor, it was confinement, a cage made of faith and fear. He tried to pray. He whispered the catechism of duty, the litany of endurance, the oath of the astartes. The words came hollow, like echoes in a cavern. For every line of devotion he recited, the image of that dead child burned brighter behind his eyes. He pressed his palms together, as if trying to crush the memory into silence. "Your silence speaks louder than your words," a voice said from the shadows. Cassian turned. Veridus stood at the threshold, the candlelight catching the polished surface of his skull helm. The chaplain moved closer, the air around him filled with the scent of incense and ozone. "You hesitate," Veridus said softly. You question. Cassian's breath caught. I saw civilians. A child. Rebels. Veridus corrected, his tone sharp as a blade. Their innocence died the moment they turned from the Emperor's light. They weren't armed, Cassian replied, barely above a whisper. Veridus tilted his head. The rot of rebellion begins not with the gun, but with the thought. If you cannot see that, you are not yet reborn. You are still shackled to the weakness of man. Cassian looked down, his hands trembling. Is that weakness or mercy? For a long moment, the chaplain said nothing. The silence stretched like a drawn wire between them. Then Veridus reached out and placed a hand upon Cassian's shoulder plate. Mercy, he said quietly, is a privilege reserved for the Emperor alone. We are his instruments, not his judges. The blade does not question the hand that wields it. Cassian felt the words sink into him like cold iron. The chaplain turned to leave, pausing at the door. You will join me tomorrow, he said. A test of faith awaits. When he was gone, Cassian sat motionless, the candles burning lower. He thought of his life before the monastery, the faces of his parents, long forgotten. He couldn't even recall his true name now. Cassian was the one given to him, the one the chapter would remember if he proved worthy. But in that moment, he realized something terrifying. He didn't know who he was for. That night, he dreamt of the Emperor, not the radiant god from the hymns, but something distant and terrible, a figure of golden flame standing amidst endless ruin. Around him, billions knelt in silence, their faces melting into ash under the heat of his light. Cassian stood among them, shouting for mercy, but his voice was swallowed by the roar of burning wings. When he awoke, his armor's vox grill was crackling with a new order. The chaplain's voice filled the air once more. Recruits will report to the Hall of Penitence. Come cleansed, or be cleansed. Cassian rose slowly, the dream still burning behind his eyes. He had seen the Emperor's light, and he wasn't sure he wanted to see it again. The Hall of Penitence awaited, where obedience was no longer a lesson, but a scar. The Hall of Penitence was buried deep within the monastery, far below the vox-lit corridors where most initiates trained. It was said to have been carved from the rock of the mountain itself, a place where even the echoes dared not return. When Cassian descended the winding stair, guided by torchlight and silence, he felt as though he were walking into the lungs of a sleeping god, each breath heavy with incense and iron. The doors at the base of the stair were massive, forged of blackened adamantium and marked with sigils of atonement. Cassian placed his palm against the seal. It was warm, too warm, as if something living pulsed beneath. With a groan of old hinges, the gate opened, and the scent of burning oil filled his lungs. Inside, rows of kneeling figures stretched into the gloom. Recruits like him, silent, armored, motionless. The air trembled with the low, droning hum of mechanical chanting. At the far end of the chamber stood a row of servo altars, their limbs bristling with instruments both surgical and sacred. Between them walked Veridus, his armor wreathed in golden light. The chaplain's Crozius Arcanum glimmered in one hand, the other holding a data slate inscribed with a single word, Repentia. He did not speak at first, he merely walked, his footsteps echoing off the cold stone, pausing before each initiate as the servitors read from the litany of purification. When his gaze finally found Cassian, it lingered. Step forward. Cassian obeyed. He moved through the rows of brothers until he stood alone beneath the flickering lumen halo. Veridus studied him in silence, then spoke in a voice that filled the chamber like thunder wrapped in velvet. You question the Emperor's will. Cassian's throat tightened. I do not speak, Veridus interrupted. To question is to speak without permission, to think without faith, to live without purpose. The Emperor's truth requires neither explanation nor understanding, only surrender. He raised the Crozius. You will be purged of uncertainty. Kneel. Cassian sank to one knee. The servo altars stirred, their limbs whirring to life. One descended, pressing a metal crown upon his head. Tiny needles slid into his scalp. He gasped as a burning sensation crawled through his skull, blooming behind his eyes. Images flooded his mind. Battlefields, flames, the screams of traitors and saints alike. He saw terror beneath a storm of fire, the Emperor's radiance blinding him from the golden throne. Then came the voice. Not Veridus, not human. It was everywhere at once, resonating through bone and blood. You are mine. You are the weapon. You will serve. Cassian cried out, but no sound escaped his lips. His mind was stripped bare, his memories torn open like fragile parchment. Every doubt, every hesitation flayed and dissected under that terrible light. When the pain reached its peak, something broke. A sudden silence, deep and absolute, filled him. He didn't know how long it lasted. Seconds, hours, eternity. It all blurred. When his senses returned, he was lying on the cold floor, sweat freezing on his skin. The needles had been withdrawn. The crown was gone. Verida stood above him, calm as ever. "Rise," the chaplain said, "and tell me what you have learned." Cassian pushed himself up on shaking legs. His mouth was dry, his vision swimming. For a moment, he thought to say what Veridus wanted to hear, to repeat the doctrine, to feign clarity, but the words wouldn't come. Instead he said, "I learned that even the Emperor's light burns." The chaplain regarded him quietly. "Good," he said at last. "Then you have seen its truth." Cassian blinked, uncertain whether he had passed or failed. Veridus turned away, his voice echoing through the hall. "All who stand in his light are consumed. That is the burden of glory. That is the price of obedience." One by one, the recruits were dismissed, their steps hollow as they ascended back toward the world of the living. Cassian lingered a moment longer. The air here felt different now, charged heavy with something unseen. He looked to the walls and saw faint outlines of names carved into the stone, not prayers, but confessions. Hundreds, maybe thousands of them. "Forgive me, I believed too much. I could not see the light." Each line a whisper of someone who had once stood where he did, someone who had looked into the same abyss and either surrendered to it, or vanished within. When Cassian finally emerged into the gray daylight above, the sun was just beginning to rise over the mountain peaks. The light struck his armor, reflecting off the surface in muted gold. He thought it should have felt like redemption. Instead, it felt like exposure. From that day on, something in him changed. His brothers noticed it too. He trained harder, spoke less, fought with precision that bordered on coldness. He began to move like a man who had accepted his fate, yet somewhere deep inside, the ember of defiance still glowed faintly, unseen but not extinguished. That night, as he lay in his cell, Cassian heard the distant toll of the monastery's bells. Their tone was deep and sorrowful, a sound meant for mourning. He didn't know who had died, only that the echoes carried through the halls like a memory that refused to fade. He wondered if this was what salvation truly felt like, being hollow enough to hold the will of gods. The next dawn would bring another order, a mission beyond the monastery, a chance to prove his purity, or expose his cracks. When the summons came, it was delivered by a servo skull bearing the mark of the reclusium. Its hollow eyes flickered with blue light as it hovered before Cassian's chamber door. A ribbon of parchment trailed from its jaw, the words scrawled in ink as dark as dried blood. Deployment order. Verification of faith. Carthian subsector. The seal at the bottom bore the sigil of Veridus himself. Cassian rose without hesitation. He had learned by now that refusal was not rebellion. It was erasure, and erasure was the quiet death every recruit feared more than any battlefield. The dropship's hold smelled of incense and ozone. Around him the other neophytes checked their weapons in silence, the rhythmic click of bolter mechanisms blending with the hum of the vessel's engines. The light inside was dim, filtered through crimson glass, giving everything the hue of coagulated blood. Veridus stood at the front, one gauntleted hand resting on his crozius, the other raised in benediction. "Brothers," he said, his voice calm and steady, "faith is not measured in words or worship, but in the precision of your obedience. Today you will purge the heretics who call themselves the children of solace. They hide within the ruins of Hive. They call for peace in defiance of the Emperor's war. You will show them that peace is the language of cowards." A chorus of vox affirmations filled the cabin. Cassian's came last, his voice a fraction too late. The dropship descended through toxic clouds. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the skeletal remains of what had once been a proud Hive city. Hive was a corpse of iron, its towers shattered, its streets drowned in rust and rain. As the ramp opened, a wave of heat and ash rolled in. Cassian's boots hit the ground first. The wind carried with it the faint scent of rot and incense, two fragrances forever at war in the Imperium. The squad formed up quickly, fanning out into the ruins. Statues of saints and martyrs loomed above them, their faces eroded by centuries of acid rain. Then came the first sound, a single note of music. Faint, human, carried through the static-laden air. A hymn. Cassian froze. The melody was fragile, trembling. He recognized it from the monastery's morning liturgy, the canticle of deliverance. But here it was sung not in triumph, but in mourning. Veridus' voice crackled through the vox. Advance, silence the blasphemy. They moved. The hymn grew louder as they neared the central square, where a gathering of figures knelt around a makeshift altar. Men, women, even children. They were dressed in grey robes, their heads bowed, unarmed. The altar itself was a broken statue, once a depiction of the emperor, now covered in garlands of wilted flowers. Veridus stepped forward, his Crozius humming with energy. "You kneel before false hope," he declared. "You pray to silence when the galaxy screams for war. There is no solace outside the emperor's fury." An old man at the front lifted his head. His voice, when he spoke, was soft and tired. "We do not deny the emperor. We only ask for mercy, for the right to rest in his light without killing in his name." Veridus' reply was a swing of his Crozius. The man's body crumpled instantly, the impact cracking stone and bone alike. The hymn faltered, breaking into sobs. Cassian's hands trembled around his bolter. "Fire," Veridus commanded. The world exploded into light and sound. Bolter rounds tore through the crowd, shattering bodies and walls alike. Cassian's visor flared red with targeting glyphs. His brothers advanced methodically, each shot precise, unrelenting. But Cassian hesitated. He turned his aim toward the sky instead, firing into the storm. The recoil slammed into his shoulder, the gun's roar masking the beat of his heart. To anyone watching through the smoke, it would look like compliance. When the firing ceased, the hymn was gone. Only the rain remained, whispering over the ruins like a funeral chant. Veridus approached Cassian, his expression unreadable behind the skull helm. "You fired high," he said simply. Cassian froze. "My auspex miscalibrated," he lied. The chaplain regarded him for a long, unbearable moment. Then, to Cassian's shock, Veridus nodded. "Perhaps," he said softly. "But remember this, brother. The Emperor sees not through machines but through the truth of your heart. Make certain it beats for him, and for nothing else." He turned and walked away, his robes sweeping ash across the ground. Cassian stood there long after the others had moved on, staring at the lifeless forms around the altar. The old man's outstretched hand still pointed toward the sky, fingers frozen in what might have been prayer or accusation. Something inside Cassian broke. It was quiet, almost imperceptible, like the sound of a hairline crack in glass. But he felt it deeply, a fracture that no amount of faith could mend. That night, as they made camp among the ruins, Cassian couldn't sleep. The storm outside raged on, wind howling through the shattered towers like the wails of ghosts. He removed his helm and looked up at the faint light of distant stars. He wondered if any of them were real, or if the Astronomican's glare had drowned them all. And then he whispered the old man's words to himself. The right to rest in his light. A prayer, or perhaps a rebellion. Either way, the Emperor had heard him. The storm raged for 3 days over the dead hive, tearing at the ruins as if the planet itself sought to erase what had happened there. The air stank of ionized ash and blood, and every gust of wind sounded like a voice half swallowed by thunder. Cassian and his brothers waited for extraction within the shattered remains of a manufactorum, their armor streaked with soot and grime, their weapons resting on their knees like sacred relics. They spoke little. Silence had become its own form of devotion. But beneath the stillness, Cassian could feel it, something unsettled. The others were restless. They looked at him differently now, not with suspicion, not yet, but with awareness. He had become the one who hesitated, the one whose bolter always fired a fraction too late. That night, Veridus gathered them for confession. The chaplain stood before the broken altar they had made from fallen stone, his Crozius gleaming faintly in the stormlight. His voice carried easily, low and measured. "Sin," he said, "is the whisper that tells you the Emperor's will is cruel, that mercy is wisdom, that death can be questioned. You must learn to love the cruelty of his perfection, for it is the crucible that keeps your soul pure." Cassian kept his gaze fixed on the floor. Every word from Veridus felt like another stone being placed upon his chest. Around him, his brothers murmured prayers, their voices merging into a single droning hum. The sound filled the chamber like the pulse of a living machine. When the ritual ended, Veridus approached him. "Walk with me," the chaplain said. They stepped out into the storm. The rain struck their armor in hard metallic bursts, sliding down ceramite like tears on glass. The sky above was a void of swirling smoke and lightning, the light of distant orbiting ships flickering faintly through the haze. "Do you know why I chose you for this campaign?" Veridus asked. Cassian hesitated. "To test me." The chaplain turned slightly, the skull helm reflecting a jagged bolt of lightning. "No, to teach you, you carry the sickness of thought, Cassian. You see the humanity that must die before you can be reborn, but you do not yet hate it enough." "I do not hate," Cassian said quietly. "I endure." Viridus tilted his head. "Then you are close. The Emperor endures all things and feels nothing. You must learn to do the same." They stopped at the edge of the broken square where the massacre had taken place. The bodies were gone now, burned and scattered, but the ground still bore the blackened scars of the bolt of fire. The storm had done little to wash away the smell. "Look upon this," Viridus said. "This is what obedience looks like. Clean, absolute. Every corpse a hymn to the Emperor's will." Cassian's jaw clenched. The words burned like acid. And what if the hymn was wrong? Viridus turned to him fully. The glow of his helm's optics pierced the darkness. "Then the Emperor will judge the one who sings it," he said, "not the blade that carried the tune." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind howled through the ruins, carrying the faint echo of a song that was no longer there. Cassian felt something stir within him, a quiet, stubborn pulse that refused to die. "I saw his light," Cassian said finally, "in the Hall of Penitence. It burns everything. It leaves nothing behind." "Good," Viridus replied softly. "That is how it must be. To serve him is to die every day, until there is nothing left but faith." He reached out and placed a hand on Cassian's chest plate. "You are not lost, brother. You are only unfinished." Then he turned and walked back toward the shelter, leaving Cassian standing alone in the rain. He stayed there for hours, watching the horizon. Somewhere beyond the clouds, the stars flickered faintly, their light struggling to pierce the pollution and smoke. He wondered if the Emperor could see them from the golden throne, or if his light had blinded him to everything but his own radiance. When the extraction ship finally arrived, Cassian followed the others aboard without a word. The flight back was long and silent, the rhythmic hum of the engines like the heartbeat of a dying god. Back within the monastery, debriefing was brief and clinical. The data slates recorded the operation as a success. Heretics purged, faith verified, recruits strengthened through trial. Cassian's name appeared alongside commendations for obedience. He wanted to laugh, but even that had been taken from him. That night, as he removed his armor, he caught sight of himself in the reflection of the polished ceramite breastplate. The man staring back at him was something else entirely. Paler, harder, almost mechanical. Ours still looked human, but the gaze behind them had grown distant, like a candle burning behind thick glass. He pressed a hand to the plate, feeling the faint warmth beneath. For a moment he thought he could feel his heart beating. Still there, still defiant. Then came the whisper, soft and metallic, carried through the vox by no living voice. "Cassian, do you still serve?" He froze. The vox unit was inactive. The dormitory around him was empty, yet the voice lingered familiar, resonant, heavy with something that wasn't command but invitation. He didn't answer. He only stared into the reflection until the image seemed to blur and shift, as though another face, one older, golden, sorrowful, were looking back at him, and then it was gone. Cassian sat in silence long after the lights dimmed, wondering if what he had heard was a test, a dream, or the Emperor himself, asking a question he already knew the answer to. Tomorrow, they said, would bring a new assignment, a pilgrimage to Terra, the center of faith, the heart of humanity, and perhaps the place where Cassian would finally learn whether obedience truly bought salvation, or merely postponed damnation. The void voyage to Terra was not a journey, it was a descent. The transport ship, Glorium Invictus, moved through the Imperium like a blade through coagulated blood. The warp storms licked its hull with tongues of unreal fire, the Geller field shimmering with strain as it fought to hold the madness at bay. Within its metallic bowels, hundreds of space marines sat in silence, motionless in their restraints, their faces dimly lit by the pulsing red emergency glow of the lumen strips. Cassian had always imagined Terra as light, a radiant sphere of gold beneath the Emperor's eternal gaze. But as the ship broke through the warp and reality reassembled itself in fractured whispers, he saw the truth. The throne world was not a beacon. It was a wound that refused to heal. From orbit, Terra was neither blue nor green, but gray, choked with dust and ruin. Layers of hive stacks rose like rusted tombs, each piled upon the last, a monument to millennia of devotion and decay. The air shimmered with the heat of Prometheum fires. The oceans had long since boiled away, leaving behind endless plains of cracked salt and ash. Above it all loomed the palace, impossibly vast, a continent of gold and bone. Even from orbit, It dominated the horizon, its towers piercing the clouds like spears of judgment. The descent burned the sky. The transport cut through the atmosphere with the fury of a meteor, streaking past the skeletal remnants of orbital stations and shrines long abandoned. As they neared the surface, Cassian felt the weight of the planet pressing against his chest, not the gravity, but something heavier, a presence. The Emperor's will perhaps, or the echo of 10,000 prayers murmured in despair. When the ramp finally opened, the air that entered the hold was thick with the scent of incense and decay. It clung to the throat, sweet and sickly, like a dying flower. They disembarked onto the surface of the Sanctum Imperialis, where even the dust was sacred. Servitors shuffled past, their flesh fused with bronze tubing and augmetic limbs, their faces blank behind iron masks. Ecclesiastical priests knelt in the streets, their lips bleeding from endless recitation. Every wall, every stone, every gate was carved with symbols of the Aquila, each stroke a prayer, each curve a wound. Cassian's eyes followed the horizon. Beyond the towering cathedra and the endless lines of pilgrims, he saw it, the golden dome, the Astronomican's chamber, the beacon that lit the galaxy. Its light was invisible, yet it could be felt, a subtle pulse that tugged at the edges of the soul. Veridus walked beside him, silent as ever, but even the chaplain's composure faltered as they approached the outer sanctum. Here, even a space marine was small. The walls were vast enough to house entire hives. The gates were carved with the faces of angels, whose eyes seemed to move, watching, judging. "This is where we were born," Veridus said, his voice a low growl through the vox grill, "not in the flesh, but in purpose. This is the heart of the Imperium. Do you feel it, brother?" Cassian nodded. "I feel something good," Veridus replied. "That is fear, the first truth." They marched in silence through corridors lined with statues of heroes long dead. Custodians watched from the shadows, their golden armor catching the torchlight like molten suns. Cassian could feel their gaze, sharp and precise, dissecting every movement, every breath. To stand before a custodian was to stand before a fragment of perfection. Even the chaplain's faith seemed small beside them. They were led through a vast hall, where the ceiling vanished into shadow. The air thrummed with power. Great cables pulsed with energy, carrying life from the vaults below to the throne above. Here, the noise of machines became indistinguishable from the chanting of the faithful. Thousands of voices rose and fell in unison, a tide of prayer that shook the very stone. Cassian could barely hear his own thoughts beneath it. When they reached the Hall of Witness, Veridus stopped. "From this point," he said, "we walk alone." Cassian frowned. "Alone?" Veridus turned his helm slightly, as though listening to a distant voice. "The Emperor sees what he wills, and sometimes he calls those who do not expect to hear him." Then, without another word, the chaplain turned away, his footsteps echoing down the marble hall, until the sound was swallowed by the chant. Cassian remained. He could feel the pull now, faint but insistent, like a hand pressing against his mind. He followed it, deeper into the sanctum. The walls grew narrower, the light dimmer, the air grew warmer, heavy with the scent of burning oil and old metal. He found himself before a door unlike any other, small, unadorned, forgotten. It should not have been there, but it was. As he reached for it, the air trembled. A whisper filled the silence. "Not through vox, not through fort, through faith. Do you seek me, child of blood and iron?" Cassian froze. The voice was not sound. It was memory and thunder and grief made flesh. He took a step forward, then another. The door opened without sound. Beyond it, there was only darkness, and the faint hum of a heart that was not his own. The chamber beyond was impossibly vast, yet every sound Cassian made felt deafening. His boots sank into dust that might once have been sacred ash, layered over centuries of forgotten ritual. The air itself seemed to resist movement, thick with heat and memory. As his eyes adjusted, faint golden light revealed a procession of shattered statues, saints and warriors, their faces worn smooth by time. Some were faceless entirely, their features consumed by corrosion, yet the fragments of their armor still bore the sigil of the Aquila. Each breath carried the scent of incense and ozone, a mingling of holiness and ruin. Somewhere deep below, unseen engines pulsed in rhythmic agony, feeding the endless machinery that sustained the throne. Cassian moved forward slowly, the sound of his steps echoing like the tolling of a bell. He could feel something watching him, something vast, ancient and patient. A single lumen flickered overhead, revealing an altar at the far end of the hall. Upon it lay the remnants of a reliquary, its glass cracked, its contents turned to dust. The inscriptions around it were written in High Gothic, the words worn nearly smooth, but one phrase still remained legible: in service, immortality; in doubt, oblivion. Cassian reached out, his gauntlet brushing the stone. For a moment, he thought he felt warmth beneath it, like the fading pulse of something alive. The warmth became pain, a sudden surge that coursed through his arm, searing through the ceramite. He stumbled back, his vision swimming. The world seemed to twist, and the shadows lengthened into shapes. From the darkness emerged figures, not fully formed, but memories made flesh. Space Marines, their armor gleaming, their eyes hollow. He recognized the heraldry of countless chapters: Ultramarines, Imperial fists, Blood Angels, each one marked by time, their insignias fading like old scars. They stood silently around him, forming a circle. Then from their midst a figure stepped forward. His armor was older than the Imperium itself, bronzed, engraved with runes of forgotten craftsmanship. His face was hidden behind a helm shaped like the head of an eagle, and his voice, when it came, was calm and sorrowful. "You seek meaning in a galaxy that has none," the figure said. "You are forged for war, yet dream of peace. You are the Emperor's weapon, yet you wonder what you would be without his hand guiding the blade. Tell me, son of terror, why do you walk this path?" Cassian tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. "I serve," he said at last. "I was made to serve." "Were you?" the figure asked. "Or were you made to endure?" The question lingered in the air like smoke. The others began to fade, their outlines dissolving back into the gloom, until only the eagle-helmed figure remained. He stepped closer, the golden light dimming with every pace. "The Emperor's light burns still," the figure whispered, "but its warmth no longer reaches the living. His body endures, but his will has become a storm. Do you feel it?" Cassian hesitated. "I feel his presence." "No," the figure said. "You feel his absence, and it terrifies you." The words struck like a hammer. Cassian's knees buckled. He fell to the ground, gasping as visions tore through his mind. He saw battlefields stretching from one end of the galaxy to the other. He saw entire worlds reduced to ash in the name of faith. He saw Marines dying in silence, their names forgotten even before their bodies cooled. And in the midst of it all, he saw the throne, a mountain of gold and agony, upon which a god refused to die. The light flared, the figure vanished. Cassian was alone once more, but he was not unchanged. Something in him had shifted, a fracture in his certainty. The Emperor was eternal, yes, but what kind of eternity required such suffering to sustain it? Was devotion still sacred when it was born of fear? He rose slowly, his armor creaking. His steps felt heavier now, as though the very air sought to hold him back. At the far end of the corridor, he saw another door, this one carved from black stone, marked with the sigil of the Sigillite. He knew what that meant. Malcador, the Emperor's hand, the voice of the throne, the shadow that had once whispered in his stead. Cassian reached for the seal. It crumbled to dust beneath his touch. The door swung open with a sigh like a dying breath. Inside lay a single throne of iron and stone, covered in dust. Upon it rested a book, a massive tome bound in human skin, its pages etched with runes that seemed to move of their own accord. He approached it cautiously. The air grew colder, though no wind stirred. When he reached out, his reflection flickered across the polished metal of his gauntlet, and for a heartbeat, he did not see his own face, but that of the eagle-helmed figure. He opened the book. The words were in a language older than any spoken tongue, yet he understood them. They were prayers, confessions and warnings all at once. Fragments of the Sigillite's thoughts, his doubts, his final question: if the Emperor becomes the god we made of him, will we still recognize humanity in his gaze? The page dissolved into ash. Cassian closed the book, his heart pounding. Outside, the sound of chanting returned, louder now, desperate, the faithful calling out to a god who might never answer. He turned toward the noise and walked back into the light of the sanctum, the echo of that question burning in his mind like a wound that would never heal. When Cassian emerged from the inner sanctum, the light of the temple felt foreign to him, too sharp, too clean, as though it belonged to another world. Pilgrims knelt along the marble floors, their bodies bent in endless supplication. Some had been there so long their skin had fused with the stone. The air trembled with the drone of hymns, yet beneath the reverence he could sense unease, an undertone of something broken, something that refused to heal. Veridus stood waiting near the base of a colossal statue, depicting the emperor in his prime, the warrior king, the conqueror of unification, his hand raised in eternal command. At the base, incense burned in golden braziers, their smoke curling like ghostly serpents toward the vaulted ceiling. Cassian approached silently. The chaplain turned to him, and for a moment neither spoke. The silence between them was not empty. It was heavy, laden with unspoken truth. "You saw something," Veridus said at last. Cassian nodded. "I heard his voice." The chaplain's eyes narrowed behind the skull mask. "Many claim to. Few survive it." Cassian said nothing. He couldn't describe what he'd seen. The vision, the figure, the words that had cleaved through him like a blade. It wasn't revelation. It was doubt given form. Veridus studied him for a long moment, then turned toward the statue. "Do you know why we come here, brother? Why the chapters still send emissaries to this world, even after 10,000 years of silence?" "To renew our faith," Cassian said. Veridus shook his head. "No, to remind ourselves what we fight for. The Imperium is not sustained by faith, it is sustained by fear. Fear of what lies beyond the veil. Fear of what would happen if we ever stopped believing. He watches us." Cassian looked up at the Emperor's sculpted face, carved from marble and gold. Its eyes were lifeless, yet he could almost feel them watching. "And you?" he asked quietly. "Do you still believe he watches?" Veridus hesitated. The flicker of the braziers painted his armor in shifting shades of gold and shadow. "I believe he remembers," he said at last. "And perhaps that is enough." They stood in silence as a procession of priests passed by, their voices rising in a litany that filled the hall like thunder. At the center of their formation, a great reliquary was carried upon a bed of chains. Inside it, a fragment of what they claimed was the Emperor's armor, preserved since the siege. The crowd knelt as it passed, some weeping, others screaming in ecstasy. Cassian watched them, their faces twisted in devotion so absolute it bordered on madness. He wondered how many of them truly understood what they worshipped. Later, as they walked through the outer halls, Cassian noticed the walls tremble. Faint vibrations rippled through the floor beneath their boots. It was a sound he recognized, the low, constant hum of ancient machinery under strain. The Golden Throne, perhaps, or one of the countless systems that sustained it. The entire planet seemed alive, yet dying in slow motion, every breath of the machine god powered by 1,000 dying prayers. They passed through the Chamber of Echoes, where pilgrims left offerings of blood and tears. The walls were inscribed with billions of names, each one a life sacrificed in the Emperor's name. Some were fresh, others so eroded that only the faintest grooves remained. Cassian reached out, tracing one of the older markings. The stone was cold beneath his gauntlet. "Every name is a promise," Veridus said behind him, "a life traded for the hope that ours will mean something." The Emperor built his empire on the bones of humanity, but he also gave them purpose. Even in death, they serve. Cassian turned to face him. But what if the purpose no longer serves him? The chaplain's gaze darkened. "Careful, brother. Doubt is a luxury for those who have not seen the abyss. We have, and we know what waits if the light ever fades." The light flickered then briefly, almost imperceptibly. Cassian looked up. The great lumen globes overhead dimmed, then flared again. The vibrations in the floor deepened into a low growl. The priests nearby fell to their knees, crying out in prayer. Some whispered that it was a sign, a pulse from the Golden Throne. Others claimed it was a warning, a tremor of divine displeasure. Veridus raised his head toward the distant ceiling. "Ah, he hears us still," he murmured, "even if the stars themselves have forgotten his name." But Cassian wasn't sure. He could feel the same presence he had felt in the chamber, distant, immense, and fading. It was not the warmth of faith, but the echo of something once vast now collapsing inward. That night, he stood upon the balcony of their assigned quarters, overlooking the sprawl of the Imperial Palace. Below, the lights of the Manufactoria burned through the smog, rivers of fire winding between towers of bone-white stone. Beyond the walls, the wastelands of terror stretched to the horizon, a broken world sustained only by devotion and machinery. He thought of the figure he had seen, of the words spoken in the dark. He thought of the book, the ashes, the question, if the Emperor becomes the god we made of him, will we still recognize humanity in his gaze? The wind carried the scent of ash and incense. Somewhere far below, 1,000 pilgrims screamed the Emperor's name as their bodies were consumed in ritual fire. Cassian watched the flames rise into the night sky like falling stars, and he wondered, not for the first time, whether any of them would ever be heard. Morning on Terra was not morning as it was known on other worlds. The sun never truly rose. Instead, light seeped through the ochre smog like a wounded thing, thin and trembling, painting the horizon in dull amber. The air was thick enough to taste dust, oil, sanctified incense, and the faint constant tang of ozone from the city's ancient shielding arrays. Cassian stood on the same balcony where he had watched the night burn away, his armor dimmed and unadorned, his helm clutched under one arm. The view was endless, yet suffocating, towers upon towers, layers of steel and stone stacked atop corpses of older civilizations. Every inch of Terra was history buried beneath itself. He turned at the sound of approaching footsteps. Veridus entered the chamber, his armor freshly anointed, his Crozius Arcanum hanging from a chain at his side. He moved like a man carrying the weight of eternity, each step deliberate, each word measured. "It is time," the chaplain said. Cassian inclined his head. Time for what? To stand before the throne. The words hung heavy in the air. Even after all he had seen, the idea felt impossible. To stand before the Emperor himself, even for a moment, was to confront divinity. To witness the still-beating heart of the Imperium, they left their quarters in silence. Their escort awaited them beyond the gates, custodians clad in golden plate, their halberds gleaming with the light of captive suns. They did not speak, nor acknowledge the presence of their charges. They simply moved, and the world seemed to move with them. The journey through the palace took hours, though Cassian could not measure time properly within those walls. The architecture itself defied reason. Corridors twisted upon themselves, halls expanded into cathedrals, and the hum of unseen machinery echoed through every stone. The deeper they went, the quieter it became, until even the prayers faded, replaced by a silence so profound it seemed alive. At last they reached the inner sanctum, the gates of the Eternity Chamber. The custodian stopped. One stepped forward, his voice a low resonance that seemed to vibrate in Cassian's bones. "You enter at his mercy. You leave by his will. Do not speak. Do not look upon him directly. Remember that you are dust, shaped by his design." The gates opened. What lay beyond was not a room but a revelation. The air shimmered with golden light, too bright to endure, too vast to describe. The walls were alive with motion, veins of molten energy coursing through machinery that stretched into infinity. The sound was deafening, yet oddly rhythmic, the pulse of the Emperor's existence, sustained by faith and sacrifice. At the center of it all stood the golden throne. No mortal mind could contain its scale. It was both a machine and a monument, a cathedral of metal and agony, built from the bones of gods. Its frame rose like a mountain, alive with fire and machinery, wrapped in conduits that pulsed with the lifeblood of the Astronomicon. And upon it, enthroned in eternity, sat the Emperor of mankind. Cassian could not move. He felt his presence before he saw him. The weight of 1,000,000,000 souls pressed upon his chest. His vision blurred. Every sin, every act of violence, every moment of doubt screamed within his mind. When at last he dared to lift his gaze, he saw a figure bathed in light so terrible it was beautiful. The Emperor's form was both corpse and god, radiant yet broken. Tubes and conduits pierced his body, feeding the machine that had become his tomb. His eyes were closed, yet the light that emanated from his face was blinding. The air around him shimmered like heat upon glass. Cassian fell to one knee, unable to stand beneath the magnitude of it. His heart thundered, his thoughts scattered. He felt the touch of something vast brushing against his mind, ancient, cold, and infinite. It was not thought as he knew it. It was the echo of a mind that once commanded galaxies, now fractured into unending silence. "You seek purpose," the presence whispered, not in sound but in essence. "You seek meaning where there is only service." Cassian's mouth moved soundlessly. He could not answer. "You are mine," the voice continued, "as all men are mine. You are my flesh, my failure, and my vengeance. Tell me, son of war, what have you built in my name?" Images flooded his mind, worlds burning, cities drowning in faith, armies marching into oblivion under banners bearing the Aquila. The Imperium stretched across the stars, vast and unyielding, but beneath its glory he saw rot, fear, despair. 1,000 forgotten wars fought for the illusion of order. He wanted to look away but could not. The light burned through him, showing him every truth he had refused to see, and then, silence. The presence receded, the throne's light dimmed, returning to its endless pulse. Cassian realized he was trembling. He rose slowly, his armor heavy as lead. Veridus stood beside him, his head bowed, tears streaked the dust on his face. "He is," the chaplain whispered, voice breaking. "He endures still, for us, for all." Cassian wanted to believe it. He wanted to feel awe, or faith, or peace. But all he felt was the weight of the question that had haunted him since the chamber, the one that would not die. If this was divinity, then what was humanity now? The custodians signaled that their audience was over. The great doors began to close, sealing away the golden light. Cassian took one last look, not at the throne, but at the man upon it. He thought, for the briefest instant, that he saw movement, a flicker of the Emperor's hand, a breath caught between words. But when the light faded, there was nothing left but silence. The gates of the Sanctum Eternity closed behind Cassian with a sound like the ending of an age. The echo rolled through the marble corridors, lingering far too long, as if reluctant to let go of those who had glimpsed the divine. For a while he did not move. The light of the throne had seared itself into his eyes, golden, endless, unbearable. Even now, with the chamber sealed, he still saw it pulsing faintly in his vision, like an afterimage of judgment. Veridus stood beside him, silent as stone. The chaplain's face was pale beneath the black of his armor, his lips moving in wordless prayer. Cassian envied him that faith, the comfort of belief so absolute it could survive even the sight of the Emperor's broken body. For Cassian, the sight had not brought peace. It had brought only questions. They descended through the palace in silence. The custodians who had escorted them did not speak. They did not need to. Their presence alone was enough to remind Cassian that he had stood before something beyond comprehension. The corridors wound endlessly downward, through layers of gilded decay, walls of gold cracked with age, statues of forgotten saints staring with hollow eyes, and tapestries depicting wars that had ended before humankind had words to name them. Finally, they emerged into the outer halls, where the air was thick with incense and the murmuring of pilgrims. Thousands of voices chanted in unison, their prayers echoing up toward the heavens. The smell of burning oils, sweat, and sanctified ash filled the space. Cassian paused. The sight was staggering. A sea of humanity stretched before him, pilgrims crawling on bloodied knees, nobles draped in perfumed silks, priests swinging censers heavy with smoke. Some wept, some laughed, some simply stared upward, their eyes glazed in rapture. All of them were here for the same reason: to be near him. Veridus watched them with quiet reverence. "Do you see, brother?" he murmured. "This is his will made manifest. They come from every world, every creed, every sin, and yet here before his light, they are one." Cassian's gaze drifted across the crowd, the faces blurred together, hope and madness intertwined. "And what happens," he said softly, "when the light fades?" The chaplain turned sharply. "It does not fade. It cannot." Cassian said nothing. He did not trust his voice. They made their way through the crowd, the pilgrims parting before them like water before a prow. Whispers followed in their wake. Astartes, angels of death, the Emperor's chosen. Some reached out to touch Cassian's armor, as though believing that contact alone might grant them salvation. He could feel the desperation in their hands, their trembling faith pressing against him like the weight of worlds. He thought of the Emperor's voice, ancient, cold, weary beyond words. "You are mine." When they reached the outer gates of the palace, the custodians halted. One stepped forward and inclined his head. "Your audience is complete. You are dismissed." Veridus bowed deeply. "We are honored." Cassian gave no reply. He simply turned and walked into the light. Outside, the world was chaos. Terror stretched endlessly in every direction, hive towers piercing the clouds, manufactorums vomiting smoke, skyships crawling like insects through the smog. Yet amid the ruin, there was beauty. Cathedrals rose like blades, their spires gilded with prayer script, their bells tolling with the weight of eternity. He walked for hours, past markets of relic sellers and processions of penitents, until the palace was only a golden shimmer on the horizon. At last he found himself on the edge of the lower hive, where the air grew thick and the light dim. Here the faith of mankind was no longer marble and gold. It was hunger and blood and whispered prayers to survive another day. Cassian stopped beside a ruined shrine. The statue that once stood there was shattered, its head lying in the gutter. Children played in the mud near its base, their laughter thin and brittle. An old woman sat beside the broken altar, lighting candles with hands that trembled from age and cold. She looked up as Cassian approached. Her eyes were clouded, but her voice was strong. "Blessings of the throne upon you, my lord." Cassian hesitated. The title felt hollow. "You pray to him still?" he asked. "Always," she said, "even when he does not answer. That is when faith matters most." Her words lingered long after he left. By the time night fell, he had reached the transport docks. The air was alive with the roar of engines, the crackle of power fields, the endless announcements of ships departing for every corner of the Imperium. He looked up at the stars, distant, cold, unreachable, and for the first time since his ascension, he wondered if humanity had lost its way. The Emperor still lived. Cassian had seen it with his own eyes, but life was not the same as presence. The Imperium moved on like a corpse, animated by memory, sustained by faith, by fear, by duty, but without direction. He felt the chill of the void settling in his heart. Somewhere deep inside, a thought took shape, quiet, treacherous, undeniable. If the Emperor endures, but does not guide, then who truly rules mankind? Veridus would call it heresy. The ecclesiarchy would call it blasphemy. But Cassian no longer cared. The truth, he suspected, was something far darker and far older than faith would allow. As he boarded the gunmetal gray transport that would take him away from terror, Cassian turned for one last look at the Imperial Palace. Its towers glowed against the smog like a dying sun. For the first time in his long life, he felt not pride, but doubt, and in the silence that followed, the Emperor's words echoed once more through his mind. "You are mine." The transport lifted from the landing pad with the deep hum of grav engines, rising through the smog-choked skies of terror until the world below became a dull, burning wound. Cassian sat in silence within the passenger bay, his armor dim beneath the flickering lumen strips. Around him, a handful of silent serfs operated the vessel's systems, voxes whispering reports, runes glowing faintly across the data slates in their trembling hands. None dared speak to him. To them, he was a demigod returning from the throne itself, his presence both awe and terror. He closed his eyes. The rhythm of the engines became a pulse, steady and relentless. But beneath it, something else stirred, a whisper, faint and impossible, threading through the static of his vox bead. "Cassian." He froze. The sound was not external, it resonated within his mind, like the echo of a forgotten memory. The tone was the same, measured, ancient, unyielding. The Emperor's voice. He tried to silence the thought, to crush it beneath the discipline of a space marine, but it lingered, threading deeper. "Do not fear what you are becoming." He opened his eyes. The interior of the transport swam in pale light, the air thick and heavy. The serfs continued their duties, unaware of the storm that gathered inside his skull. The whisper faded, leaving behind a silence more suffocating than the noise. Hours later, the ship broke through the upper atmosphere. The stars unfolded above him like a wound in the fabric of night. Cassian rose, moving toward the observation viewport. The void stretched endlessly, black, cold, indifferent. Once, the sight had stirred awe within him. Now it felt empty. He thought of the Emperor's words in the sanctum, "You are mine." They had not been a blessing. They had been a command, a binding, and in their shadow, Cassian felt something inside him changing, something awakening. The ship slipped into orbit, docking with a vast orbital fortress that hung above terror like a steel halo. It was a bastion of the adeptus astartes, a meeting place for those rare few who had served the throne directly and returned alive. The corridors were lined with banners bearing the sigils of a dozen chapters, some glorious, some extinct. As Cassian disembarked, a familiar figure awaited him, Inquisitor Kael Dawn, draped in crimson robes and flanked by servo skulls, regarded him with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Brother Captain Cassian," Dawn said smoothly, "you have been in the presence of the master of mankind. Few living beings can claim such a privilege." Cassian's gaze was steady. "A privilege," he said quietly, "or a burden?" Dawn chuckled. "That depends on what he told you." Cassian said nothing. Dawn's smile faded slightly. "The High Lords are concerned. Your chapter's deployment near the Maelstrom remains unresolved. You have yet to deliver your report." "I will deliver it," Cassian replied, "when I understand what it truly means." Dawn studied him for a moment, his cybernetic eyes flickering. "Careful, Captain, the throne does not tolerate doubt." "The throne," Cassian said softly, "tolerates nothing, it endures." The Inquisitor's expression darkened, but he said no more. With a curt gesture, he dismissed his retinue and departed down the corridor, his robes whispering like the wings of a carrion bird. Cassian made his way to his quarters, a chamber of steel and silence. He removed his helmet, feeling the cool air against his scarred skin. In the reflection of a polished adamantium wall, he saw himself, a relic of war, his features carved by centuries of battle, but his eyes were not the same. There was something behind them now, something ancient, patient and watching. He sank to one knee before the small shrine set into the wall. The imperial aquila gleamed faintly in the dim light. He bowed his head, not in prayer, but in defiance of the silence pressing against him. "Why me?" he whispered. "Out of all who serve, you why me?" There was no answer. Only the faint hum of the station's systems, the whisper of recycled air, and the soft, almost inaudible rhythm of his own heartbeat. Then from somewhere deep within the walls, came a pulse, a resonance that matched his heartbeat precisely. His hand moved to his chest instinctively. The pulse grew stronger, echoing within him, until it was impossible to tell where it began or ended. He remembered the Emperor's gaze, the unbearable weight of it, the light that stripped away all illusion. In that moment, he had felt something being given to him, or perhaps taken. Now he began to understand. The voice returned, softer this time, almost human. "There is no salvation in obedience, only in purpose." He rose slowly, the light in the chamber flickered, and for a heartbeat, the reflection in the wall was not his own. It was golden, radiant, burning from within. Then it was gone. Cassian drew a long, shuddering breath. Whatever the Emperor had done to him, it was not a blessing. It was a seed, a spark meant to ignite something yet unknown. And somewhere, deep within the endless void of the Imperium, that spark was already beginning to burn. Sleep did not come to Cassian that night. The orbital fortress never truly slept. Its systems hummed with mechanical precision, its vox channels whispered with coded prayers, and its vast steel arteries pulsed with the movement of servitors and tech adepts keeping vigil over the eternal machine. He sat motionless beside the viewport, the curve of terror visible below him like a wounded titan, its atmosphere glowing faintly beneath the scarlet shimmer of its shields. Every few minutes a transport would rise or descend through the void, tiny motes of light against an ocean of black. And through it all, that pulse within his chest refused to quiet. It felt less like a heartbeat now, and more like an echo, something older, deeper, resonating from a place he could not name. He had heard it before, in the sanctum of the Golden Throne, when the Emperor's gaze had pierced him to the core. It was not human, it was not divine, it was something between. He rose and moved toward the data altar, his hands tracing the worn edges of the prayer-etched console. The runes flickered under his touch, and a low hum of machine spirits responded to his presence. He requested access to the restricted archives, a request that should have been denied. Instead, the sigils glowed green. Access granted. The machine recognized him. A cascade of images filled the air, a holographic display of gene seed strains, ancient battle records, psychic resonance readings, and encrypted files marked with the sigil of the sigillite. Many of these records were forbidden even to inquisitors, locked behind layers of imperial secrecy that spanned millennia, and yet, they opened to him like doors long awaiting his return. He scrolled through the data in silence, the truth unfolding in fragments. There were patterns, records of space marines who had stood before the Emperor's psychic presence and returned, changed, enhanced in ways no apothecary could explain. Some had vanished into the warp, others had been reassigned to unknown theaters. A few had risen to impossible feats before meeting inexplicable deaths. The file names blurred together, but one stood out, a designation from before the Horus Heresy, marked simply, Project Raynor. Cassian opened it. The screen bled static, the machine spirit shuddering under the strain. Then, slowly, a single image stabilized. It was a figure in Mark II Crusade armor, kneeling before a golden throne not unlike the one that ruled Terra now. The accompanying text was fragmented, corrupted by time, but a phrase remained, burned into the data, the vessel of continuance, the flesh that remembers. Cassian stared at it for a long time. Then he whispered, "What did you make of us?" A sudden tremor shook the room, the lumen strips dimming for a moment before stabilizing. When the light returned, Cassian saw a shape behind him, tall, indistinct, half seen in the reflection of the viewport. He turned sharply, hand moving toward his bolter, but there was nothing, only the faint scent of ozone and the lingering shimmer of psychic residue. He had seen such things before, in the dying visions of librarians overwhelmed by the warp, in the half-light of daemon worlds where reality frayed at the edges. But this was different. This was controlled, intentional. His vox bead crackled. A voice, old, dry and layered with metallic distortion, spoke through the channel. "You saw it, didn't you, brother captain?" Cassian froze. "Who is this?" "The truth," the voice replied, "or what remains of it. We are what the Emperor left behind." He recognized the modulation, mechanical, ancient, yet familiar. "Tech priest designation," he asked cautiously. A low chuckle followed. "Once, now, something else. We have watched you, Cassian. You have been marked." The connection cut abruptly. Silence fell again, thick and oppressive. Cassian stood there, his pulse thundering in his ears. He turned once more to the viewport, where Terra's light had faded into shadow. Somewhere beyond those clouds, beneath the mountains of machinery and faith, the Emperor still lived, if life was even the right word for it. The pulse in Cassian's chest intensified, resonating now with the rhythm of the throne itself, as if answering some unseen call. His breath caught as the world around him began to fade, the edges of his vision darkening. The hum of the ship deepened into a distant chant. He was no longer in his quarters. He stood within a vast chamber of gold and shadow. The air shimmered with heat and sanctity. Around him, faceless figures knelt, their bodies half mechanical, half human, their mouths moving in perfect unison, as they chanted words too ancient for meaning. At the far end of the hall, seated upon an impossible dais, was the throne, and upon it, a figure, not quite alive, not entirely dead, glowed with divine radiance. The Emperor's gaze turned toward him. Cassian fell to his knees. His armor felt like stone, his lungs like fire. "My lord," he gasped. The light intensified until it filled everything, and from within it came a voice, not thunderous, but sorrowful. "You were never meant to understand. You were meant to endure." When Cassian awoke, he was back in his quarters, lying on the cold steel floor. The hum of the fortress had returned to its steady rhythm, but the pulse was gone. His chest was silent. For the first time in centuries, he felt human again, and utterly alone. When dawn came, it did not arrive with light, for there was no dawn aboard the fortress, only the shift of chronometers and the faint change in the pitch of the machine hymns that echoed through its decks. Cassian stood before the viewport once more, watching the silent orbit of terror below, the world veiled beneath an amber haze of devotion and decay. The pulse in his chest was gone, but its absence felt like a wound, an emptiness that thrummed with unspoken memory. He did not pray. He could not. The words that once brought him peace now felt hollow, fragile as dust in the endless machinery of faith. He had seen too much. The Emperor's light no longer felt distant and holy. It had become intimate, invasive, a presence that had reached inside him and rewritten what he was. And now that presence was gone, leaving behind only the echo of something vast and unfinished. A chime sounded through the chamber, a summons. He turned toward the door as it hissed open. Inquisitor Kale Dawn entered, flanked by 2 custodian guards. The custodians' golden armor glowed faintly in the dim light, their every movement precise, deliberate and terrifyingly calm. Dawn's eyes, cold and artificial, flickered with faint light. "Brother Captain Cassian," he said smoothly, his tone devoid of warmth. "The High Lords have ordered your immediate redeployment. There are questions about your encounter with the throne. They wish to ensure your loyalty remains uncompromised." Cassian regarded him in silence. "You think I am corrupted?" Dawn's lips curved faintly. "The word we prefer is altered. The Emperor's presence is not meant to linger in mortal flesh, even one such as you." The custodians said nothing, but their stance shifted, a subtle reminder that refusal was not an option. Cassian nodded slowly. "And if I refuse?" Dawn's smile sharpened. "Then we will deliver you to the throne again." Perhaps he will finish what he began. A long silence followed. The hum of the ship seemed to deepen, the air between them taut with tension. Then Cassian moved, not suddenly, but with deliberate grace. He reached for his helmet, locking it into place with a soft hiss. "Then I will go," he said, "but not for your High Lords." Dawn inclined his head. "Then for whom?" "For the Emperor," Cassian said, his voice low, resonant. "And for the truth, he can no longer speak." Without another word, he turned and walked past them, the heavy tread of his armor echoing down the corridor. The custodians watched him go, but did not move to stop him. Perhaps they too sensed something in him, something beyond their understanding. Hours later, the transport departed the fortress, its engines burning faint trails of blue fire through the void. Cassian sat alone in the bay, the hum of the ship steady beneath his boots. His orders were to report to a forward strike vessel bound for the eastern fringe, but he knew he would never reach it. The vision still haunted him, the golden chamber, the Emperor's sorrowful voice, the phrase, "You were meant to endure." It was not command, it was confession, a moment of honesty from a god who had forgotten how to be human. He reached into the small compartment beside his seat and withdrew the data slate he had taken from the archives, the file marked Project Raynor. He studied the fragmentary text again, tracing the words with his gauntleted finger, the vessel of continuance, the flesh that remembers. He understood now. The Emperor had not merely blessed him, he had implanted something within him, an echo of his own psychic resonance. Cassian was not chosen to spread faith, nor to lead men into war. He was meant to preserve something, to carry it forward. Perhaps not even the Emperor himself remembered what that was anymore. A sudden tremor ran through the ship. Cassian looked up as the lumen strips flickered. The pilot's voice crackled through the vox. "Brother Captain, we've entered an unsanctioned warp corridor. Navigation systems are." The transmission cut abruptly into static. Cassian rose, moving toward the cockpit. Outside the viewport, the stars were gone. The void had turned liquid, shifting in iridescent colors that bled and folded upon themselves. Warp storms coiled around them like serpents. But within that chaos, something else appeared, a shape, vast and radiant, half-formed from light and thought. The figure was human in outline, yet endless in scale. 1,000 eyes burned within its form, each reflecting fragments of a golden throne. Cassian fell to one knee as his vision blurred. Then the voice came, not from the outside, but from everywhere. "You carry what remains of Mir. Keep it alive, even when the faith dies." Cassian's breath caught. "What am I to do?" The voice faded, replaced by the familiar rhythm of a dying star's pulse. "Endure." The light shattered, and the ship was hurled violently back into real space. The pilot was gone, the controls dead. The vessel drifted silently among the debris of forgotten wars. Cassian rose slowly, every motion heavy with exhaustion. He walked to the viewport one final time. Ahead, far beyond the shattered moons and silent wrecks, burned a faint light, distant, steady, golden. Perhaps it was the Astronomicon, perhaps it was something else. He removed his helmet, feeling the cold void pressing against the glass. "I will endure," he whispered. And in that moment, for the first time since he had stood before the Emperor, Cassian felt no command, no fear, no pain, only the faint warmth of something eternal stirring within him. Not divinity, not duty, but choice. The ship drifted onward into the dark, carrying with it the last spark of a god's memory, and the echo of a warrior who refused to die forgotten.